Professor Reuben Grima will be delivering this evening's lecture, Archaeology, as you can see, Archaeology at the Malta Pavilion, British Empire Exhibition 1924. And we shall be able to have some questions at the end, which I'm sure Professor Grima will answer. Before we begin, I'd like to announce that we have the MAR numbers 12 and 13, so a bumper edition, which we just managed to print. So the paid up members for 2024 can pick up their copy after the talk. So I think that's what we'll do. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Patricia.
Ooh.
Can the people at the back of the room hear me clearly?
Yes.
And on Zoom, is that clear enough? Great.
Yes.
So the first time I came across the Wembley exhibition in a cultural heritage context, or in any context at all, was as a first year archaeology student doing my first work phase at the Museum of Archaeology. And Tancred Gouder, the director, the curator of archaeology at the time, had asked the three of us who were doing work phase there, Nathaniel, Ramon, and myself, to mount the collection of photographs. And one of them had an inscription on the back saying items. It was a few artifacts, and it said items sent to Wembley. And I remember thinking, why on earth would you send archaeological artifacts to a football stadium? Because that's what Wembley was to me then. And it's what it still is to many people, because the event that takes place at Wembley 100 years ago is largely forgotten. And I don't just mean in Malta. It's considering the excitement that there was a century ago. It's for a long time it has been off our radar. But even as the centenary approached, there's been mounting interest in it, and a number of researchers have begun to fill this void. There are important contributions by Giovanni Bonello, who has been working on this for decades now. More recently, Chiara Ceccalupo, and I know work in progress, people like John Marlowe and Charles as well have ideas about how to take the study of that event further. So one reason for having this lecture today is not because we fully understood what happens at Wembley 100 years ago, but because it's the centenary year, and we couldn't let the centenary year go by without marking it in one other way in this lecture. Now, the first season of the excavation of the exhibition closed a few weeks ago, a century ago. Now, there was a second season in 1925, but the Malta Pavilion, which we shall be talking about, was not a part of that for a number of reasons, mainly economic. It is one of the most extraordinary events in terms of visitor numbers. It was unsurpassed at the time with 26 million visitors, and even today, that is quite an extraordinary thing. Now, this is a familiar image. I think most of you will have seen it. Can I see with a quick show of hands how many people have seen this image before? Okay,
Outside.
on the poster. Yeah. So roughly half of you. So even that is extraordinary that it's still so little known, because this is the best known image of the Malta Pavilion. At first glance, it looks like in Lina, but a rather old in Lina with bastions which look more like Fort St. Angelo. There are side gates which are in fact copies of two of the gates at Vittoriosa. It is a pastiche, and pastiche is one of the ingredients of how these exhibitions are created. Well, what I propose to do today will be divided into three parts. So we'll start with a bit of context about the idea of world exhibitions and empire exhibitions by way of background. And then we'll focus on the specific case of Wembley 1924, and specifically on how the Malta Pavilion is shaped and invented. And finally, I will try to have a look at and share some thoughts about some of the reasons behind that, what may have been going on in the choices that were made in the creation of this pavilion. So starting with the background, Crystal Palace is again one of the best known examples, but it's really one of many. There are tens and tens of these mobilizations through the second half of the 19th century and the 20th, right up to the Second World War. In many ways, the Crystal Palace begins a trend. And one of the characteristics of the way space was used in the exhibition in 1851 was that you had these large ordered buildings which would allocate space to different countries in a very tidy way. Where you have, this is the Canada, for example, which would be a section of those large structures. And this is a model which continues to be used in several of the exhibitions in the late 19th century, but other ways of exhibiting are also being invented. And just to give you a sense of the sheer number of exhibitions, this is the ones that take place in Paris alone. So you have 8 world exhibitions or colonial imperial exhibitions, which would be more limited to the French dominions and territories. And in the second one of those, we just saw this new idea, this new way of exhibiting emerges, which is that different countries are represented by a building which evokes the traditional architecture of that space. And we have here a very eloquent description, one of them, of what's happening in 1867. And this soon gets taken up and becomes a norm for many of these exhibitions. You see here the Colonial and Indian exhibition in 1886, where you're literally made to feel that you're walking through a streetscape. One of the most famous, which have been critiqued and discussed at length by Timothy Mitchell, one of the foundation texts about what happens in these exhibitions, is the simulation of a street in Cairo, again in Paris in 1889. And one characteristic of the way people build at this period, not only in the ephemeral architecture that you get in an exhibition of this kind, but also in more permanent buildings. And in some cases, you have buildings created for an exhibition, which are meant to become part of the permanent infrastructure. One characteristic is that the inside and the outside do not need to correspond. And the building, which is now the British School at Reuben, is a very good example of this. So it's designed by Hutchins in 1910 for an exhibition taking place in 1911. And the portico on the front of that building is a faithful imitation of the upper part of the portico on St. Paul's Cathedral in London. If it looks familiar, that's the reason why. Of course, it's making statements about the long tradition of nursing and classical architecture, even in Britain. once you're within it, there's absolutely no reference to that kind of architecture at all. It's a much more functional interior. And this idea of separating exterior and interior and having an exterior which makes historical references is known as historicism. It's an architectural movement which is also influencing the way decisions are taken about exhibitions and exhibition pavilions. And this is also true of the Malta Pavilion, as we shall be seeing in a moment. So there are countless examples, and there's an increasing amount of images on the web. So the Temple of Angkor, so you might wonder if it's Cambodia, but again, we're still in Paris in 1931. Yeah. Which brings us to the Wembley exhibition. Another very famous general view where you see part of the pavilion of Burma on the left and the very distinctive towers of the Wembley Stadium and the Canadian Pacific Pavilion on the right. Now, this is already showing quite different treatment in the way different countries and dominions in the British Empire are being represented. And if you keep thinking of that, this is another view of the Canada Pavilion. And here we have the Palace of Engineering and the Palace of Industry, which partly still survives today. And here, on the other hand, you have the Indian Pavilion and the better view of Burma and the Malaya at that time pavilion. Are you beginning to see a pattern here where some dominions, some colonies are represented as more exotic and different and other, while the Palace of Industry, the Palace of Engineering, the Canadian Pavilion, and the same is true of the Australian Pavilion, and even the Pavilion of the government of the United Kingdom, are all much more restrained in their design, and they're using very formal neoclassical motifs. So you have two architecture languages, one which is the language of modernity, and ultimately it is the language of those pavilions are the ones with more authority and power in the imperial framework, and others which are being portrayed as embedded in the past and not quite equipped to lead themselves, almost destined to be led by the imperial authorities in Britain and in the dominions, which are, if you like, the upper tier of the imperial hierarchy. So not all possessions in the British Empire have the same status. So Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and even South Africa at that time have a more self-determination and more autonomy than many of these other colonies. And that, to an extent, is being reflected in this architectural language. Ultimately, the purpose of these exhibitions was to encourage trade, certainly, but also to bolster the idea of empire. At the time of the Wembley exhibition, the empire is in crisis. After the First World War, where so many lives had been lost and economies shaken and resources wasted, people's expectations of an improvement in their lives is very high. And there's no coincidence that this is when you have the uprisings which lead to the Amritsar massacre in India. You have a movement in Egypt trying to attain greater self-determination. It's when Ireland begins to move towards independence and the war which is after that. And in Malta, of course, we have the 7 Giugno incidents in 1919. All those incidents, violent incidents, happen within the same year. And there is this realization that policies and practices in the empire need to change, and that both in the granting of more self-determination and in holding events which create a sense of belonging in the empire, we have the ingredients which lead to the movement which gives us the exhibition at Wembley. So where does Malta's pavilion sit on this? It's arguably closer to the model which is borrowing architectural motifs from the past. And yet they are European motifs, which it has certainly on its external shell. And this is a point we will come back to. Can't talk about the subject without giving at least a nod to a seminal work by Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities, who explores how tools like an exhibition or a museum, he doesn't speak about exhibitions per se, but many of his ideas have continued to be explored by more recent researchers, specifically in the context of the exhibition. Likewise, with the census or a map, ways of representing aren't just a representation of the world and the way it is ordered. By representing, you can change the world. You can create relationships. You can create a sense of authority. You can make a world system which is, or world empire, which is ultimately highly racist, exploitative, and very short of equity, appear more acceptable. You can legitimize or try to legitimize systems which in many ways were extremely unjust. And that is what these empire exhibitions were largely about. Timothy Mitchell has developed very similar arguments. Again, it's a seminal work. There's much more recent research, but they were foundational, particularly critiquing and taking a close look at what was happening in Paris in 1989. So that's a quick summary of those two architectural languages that we've noted, which are helping justify, legitimize the idea that there are some countries which are destined to lead and others which are embedded in the past and destined to be led and to be subject peoples. So that was by way of background. A very quick word, because I don't think it's much needed with audience, the Archaeological Society. But I just want to remind you that this is a very exciting period for archaeology in Malta. These are the halcyon years of archaeology in many ways, and especially for prehistory, for the Neolithic. So just to remind you, the realization that the megalithic buildings of Malta and the culture that created them are in fact prehistoric, not Phoenician, it was believed till then. The discovery of the Hypogeum, the excavation of Tarshian temples during the First World War. Meanwhile, the museums department is formally set up in 1922. You had the Valletta Museum before that, but it's formally instituted as a department in 1922. And it's significant that that is just 1 year after the Amory-Milner Constitution, the self-government constitution, is granted to Malta. So there is this process of reinventing the politics of what happens in Malta in a way in which the participation of the national population, of the Maltese population, has a much bigger voice and influence on it. In the early 20s, so on the eve of the exhibition, you have excavations happening at Ardalan, which leads to important discoveries and some debates which are still going on today. We don't need to dwell on these images. Tarshian, the Tarshian excavation is going to be important, which I'll come back to it, because it changes the understanding of the succession of prehistoric cultures. And of course, these are familiar images. And the sheer number of known megalithic sites, megalithic monuments of the Neolithic, really shoots up in the spring, largely thanks to the monumental efforts of Themistocles on it and his co-workers, his contemporaries. In recent years, it's changed at a much, much slower rate. So it is an extraordinary time, and prehistory is central to it. Again, that's just the report for 1 year, 1922-23. And you can see what an immense amount of work is going on at the same time, and just as one example. So I come now to how the Malta Pavilion for Wembley was designed, conceived, and implemented. And I use the word invented deliberately because in some ways there was a carte blanche. There was an open choice on which elements to use in it. Some things were laid down by the organizers in London, as we shall see, but there was a lot of freedom which was done in largely in a bottom-up way. And there's a wealth of correspondence in different archives where we see the first contact being made, the first letters being sent out to art societies. One letter is referred to the committee of the Society of Arts, Manufacture and Commerce. And initially, they're not very excited about it, but soon the idea starts gaining traction. And they confirm that Malta should participate. A special committee is appointed by the governor in July 1922. So that's less than 2 years before the actual exhibition. They're only in September, so practically a year and a half before April 1924, is when they finally decide that they are going to participate. And it's not until January 1923 that is confirmed that Malta should have a separate plot, separate building within the exhibition. So this all happens extremely fast. And this quote gives you a bit of the flavor of how this committee was constituted and how, in the climate of the new self-government constitution, a lot of importance was being given to public consultation. I've highlighted 2 names because they are the only 2 names which we are given. Otherwise, it's all institutions. And this, again, gives us a glimpse of how colonial authority is exercised. They're appointing those institutions, but they're making sure they have 2 individuals, 2 named individuals, who enjoy the full trust of the colonial authorities. So Edward Caruana Dingley, apart from being an accomplished artist, also has a military formation. He's a captain and he is very well known in the British colonial circles. Themistocles Zammit, of course, because of his contributions to the discovery of brucellosis and to the discovery of the role of the goat in the transmission of avian fever, is also highly respected and listened to. And his role in the unfolding of the story is critical. Now, initially, they decide to organize the exhibition in 7 teams, which you see there. These will collapse into 3 by the time of the exhibition. You see that archaeology is already present there. And there's a subcommittee appointed for each of these teams. Some of them produce lengthy reports. In the case of Themistocles Zammit, who writes the report for history and archaeology, he just writes a paragraph and says, I need, I forget the precise figure, so many pounds to create these models of the megalithic temples and plaster casts. And he already had a very clear idea of what the content would be and had a budget to it. And when the government assesses these reports, in some cases with the report on art, for example, it says this is far too voluminous and not quite appropriate for the exhibition. Well, in the case of Zammit's report, the response is simply fine. Let him get on with it. So, now, an even more forgotten event than the Wembley exhibition itself is this preliminary exhibition, which is conducted, which is put up in Auberge d'Italie. We mentioned a short while ago that the former Valletta Museum had been transformed into a department in 1922. And at the same time, Auberge d'Italie is allocated to house the museum. But the move only happens, it only opens as the new museum in 1925. So at this stage, we're at this in-between moment where the premises have been vacated and are available, and the museum has not moved in yet. So when a decision is taken to conduct a preparatory exhibition, it is the perfect venue. The reason for a preliminary exhibition is twofold. One, to make sure that more of the Maltese population gets to see the content of the exhibition, and to also help in the selection process, because it was clear that all the material which was being put forward, could not be accommodated in Wembley. So it was a way of letting at least more exhibitors participate. And this is one of an extraordinary series of photographs, which I'm immensely grateful to Dr. Charles Paul Sapardi, who's with us today, for sharing, which allows us to a glimpse of this extraordinary event. And you have the moment here when Field Marshal Lord Plumer, this decorated First World War general, who is responsible for administering the setting up of the Weimar Republic in Germany before he's deployed to Malta after the 1919. He arrives here a couple of days after the riots and immediately starts sorting things out and laying the ground. He does support the idea of the self-government constitution, and he works very closely with the colonial secretary, Lord Milman, and also with Leo Amery, the undersecretary, who is the man on the ground who comes out to see at first hand what the situation is. and also strikes up a rapport, a friendship with those that he's studying. You can identify a couple of persons. So there's Lady Plumber behind him, she's identified from other photographs. You can see Augustus Bartolo there, who also has an important role in the exhibition. And that is the Lieutenant Governor. So that's like sorry, Robertson's figure. The photograph is probably taken by a photographer standing on the wellhead in the courtyard at the end. And it's interesting that there isn't yet the glazing around the courtyard. Now, in the same series of photographs, we have a glimpse of the archaeological artifacts, which were, and the models and images, which were going to be put up at the exhibition. So the three paintings are part of a series which were commissioned to Robert Caruana-Bingley, so Edward's younger brother. And these models, we also know, were purposely made for the Wembley exhibition, but eventually they become a permanent part of the museum exhibition. These two paintings were known from photographs and postcards showing the interior of the Wembley exhibition. But that one, before this photograph showing the hypogeo, had not been seen before. And it's wonderful that the correspondence between Robert Caruana-Bingley and Vincenzo Bonello has been preserved, or at least one half of it, because Vincenzo was so meticulous. We haven't the other half of the correspondence yet, because as a flamboyant artist, perhaps, Robert was less concerned with keeping letters. But all the correspondence of the period when he's working on these paintings while based in Gozo, and therefore asking Vincenzo for help with procuring materials, and also letting off steam. And some of it is very unflattering about some of his artist contemporaries. There was not much love lost between some of these artists. But it's a wonderful document which Giovanni Bonello has published systematically in a chapter in the volume that he edits about Robert Caruana-Bingley. Now, it's only in June 1923, so less than a year from the opening in April 1924, that finally a design competition is launched for the design of the Malta Pavilion. And this is copied directly from the government gazette, but I typed it out to make it legible. And you see that already a number of important decisions have been taken. To begin with, what those 7 sections have now been condensed into 3 sections, which now correspond to 3 rooms in the exhibition. And also, this paragraph here is significant, that the exterior design of the building shall be an expression of a style which somehow represents Malta. It didn't specify which, but there was this expectation. And the interior of each of the 3 rooms will likewise represent the period represented there. But there's still a lot of latitude for interpretations. So by this point, those 7 teams have become 3, and archaeology, the exact words in the government gazette, are prehistoric and old times. So we see from archaeology and history, that has now become prehistoric and old times. But prehistory is gaining ground at every stage of this process and becoming a more important part of the mind. That's the second point. And thirdly, that there was to be this link in the design. Now, most of us are familiar with the appearance on the outside and with how that part of the brief was interpreted by Giuseppe Cacchia Caruana, who wins the competition. We also know that Renato La Ferrila is given second prize. But so far, I have not seen any of the drawings or designs or descriptions or photographs of what he came up with. They could surface next week if you have any relatives who may know anything about that. It's perfectly possible that more evidence will emerge, and it will be tremendously interesting to see another interpretation, see how different. We also have a glimpse of the interior, and one of the most comprehensive records that we have, which is quite known. It has been published by Giovanni Bonello and more recently by Chiara Ceccalupo, who discusses them in depth from a museological point of view. And here, for example, we see the Knights period, which is one of the three halls. And that's another view of the same, with the famous Wembley desk, which is nowadays held at Auberge d'Italie, again, museum. It's in one of the galleries upstairs. And that's a view of the first hall devoted to commerce and industry. This is one of two allegories from Britain and Malta, which most of you will remember were hanging in the staircase of the Maritime Museum and are at the moment in storage. And on the right here, you can see Plumer in full regalia, and that painting by Edward Carnegie now hangs in the Casino Montese. Coming now to our main focus today, in the same series of postcards, we have these views of the what has now, for shorthand, been described as the prehistoric Malta section. So you're seeing the same models now on exhibit. There's a point where Zamit mentions copies of vases being made. So I'm not sure if these are actual amphorae and cinerary lines from the Punic period, or if they are copies. It's hard to be sure. But there is a mention of copies when he's identifying a budget. And some of those plaster casts, the really panel that you see there, were also commissioned expressly for the that is that slip has a reason for the Wembley exhibition. Now, the thing about these images is that they all focus on all the interesting things happening at eye level and slightly higher than eye level, but we don't have many views of the ceiling. And until now, that has been very little debated. But to point out this detail, you can see these spiral motifs over here. This is another view. So we've already seen that painting hanging at Auberge d'Italie. And this, which has longer dimensions, shown Hajarhi, was also that view. While here we have a view of the interior of Ardana. And these two paintings, which are still on display in the Ardana Museum today, showing quaternary landscape. Robert Caruana Dingley, in one letter to Vincenzo Bonello, says, "Despot is really driving me up the wall with all his demands for these exotic birds, and it's really getting to me. And for the amount of money I'm getting for this really wasn't working." And the modern landscape around Ardana. Both of those are still part of the display at our gallery today. Now, till now, if you look at the published record, one of the gaps was that it seemed we didn't have the drawings of the pavilion. So in terms of the exact dimensions and the exact shape, we had to use our imagination and interpolate from these images. But sitting at the Public Works Department, one of the things I stumbled on at one stage, as one does, was a series of tracings of drawings, which are traced onto translucent paper, which allows you to produce multiple copies. Ammonia printing was the main technique for producing. And that, looking at the internal evidence, it was clear that these were contemporary working drawings, looking at all the dimensions, which were used at the time. And there's even a note, rather cryptic, saying that in 1932, on the 11th of April, it was exhibited at, and then there are 4 initials. And this little note, which appears on all of these drawings, has haunted me till 2 days ago, when I finally saw a bit of evidence which explains that mystery. Also very recently, ridiculously recently, and I'm very grateful to Stephen Tabone, gentleman of Public Works, who drew my attention to this. As part of the ongoing inventory of these drawings, another batch of drawings, which had not been formally inventoried the same way as the other numbers, where you have the number of the specific folder and drawing assigned to each, but they were in a separate batch, which I have overlooked, but also sitting in the same archive. And these are the actual drawings from the hand of Archaeological. So all the internal evidence suggests that they may actually be the competition submission. Now there is a slight issue with this, an issue with the scales, because the competition specifies 1/8 of an inch to the foot, and some of the drawings are 1/8 of an inch to the foot, but others are 1/4 inch to the foot. So a larger scale, but that may possibly have been permitted, because in many other respects, they correspond to the requirements of the research. So this is the tracing of the plan. So now for the first time, we have the exact shape and layout of the 3 rooms. So you have the commerce, industry, and tourism section, then the prehistoric and olden times, and the period of the order in this. And you see how the visitor flow works. They're all interconnected, and they have 2 subsidiary entrances apart from the main gate to permit an easy flow of visitors. And this, again, would be the drawing from the hand of Archaeological. So an elevation of the site. There are much fewer photographs which show that copy of one of the gates in Bilbo. But for me, and the reason that the Archaeological Society is the right audience for this, comes the next drawing. Because this section makes it clear that the prehistoric code was not simply referring to prehistoric art or archaeology in a general way, but it was conceived and designed as a simulation of a Neolithic monumental interior. Looking at the drawing, it could either be one of the megalithic buildings above ground, or possibly the Safliya hypogeum, which we saw a view of. And this completely bowled me over when I first saw this drawing, because all the views we had captured about this height. So this completely changes. And here we have the actual drawing, which that tracing is taken off, where you have the swash showing the shadows. And every time there's that annoying description. Esibito dall'ingegner Bonavilla nella seduta sometimes it's 11th April 1932. And then those four emissions, which given nightmares for the past year. So again, another section, and it's sure you'll be able to see this. There's a note here saying paintings in this. So in the other two chambers, the paintings such as the Allegory of Malta that we saw could hang at a higher height. But in the case of this hall, they need to fit in in the upper part of this register. So they're closer to eye level. They practically start at eye level. And this we could dim the lights, it might show up a bit more brightly. You can actually see a megalithic doorway there in one of the interconnecting chambers. But they are truly, truly handsome drawings. So suddenly this architectural form, which we could only imagine, is something we can reconstruct in great detail. Is it slightly better? And the answer to what exactly it is representing comes from the report of a speech in the Daily Malta Chronicle. So the government's engineer, Bonavilla, was sent to London to supervise the construction. When the foundation stone is laid, symbolically on the 8th of September, 1923. So they have 7 months to go to the opening day. And he tells us that the hall is a true reproduction of the main vestibule of the hypogeum. That is, they were. Which will be carried out to the minutest details, even to the pitted surface of the rock as left by the flint tools of the ancients. At least at the stage when they're laying the foundation stone, that was the intention. From the glimpses we have through the photographs, it does seem that most of this was executed to the letter, because there wasn't much time to change the design anyway. It all happens so fast. So looking at those images again, you see the spirals over there, these pillars which punctually are intended to suggest the skeuomorphic architecture in the hypogeum, the imitation of built environments carved out of the living rock. That's the source of inspiration. And so the chamber is the principal exhibit, as important as contents. Now, focusing on the painted frieze, again, thanks to the letters preserved by Vincenzo Bonello and published by Giovanni Bonello. In one of the letters, Robert Carvanavingli asks Vincenzo for help to procure the material because he's in Gozo and he can't be coming alone. He's working against the clock. And thanks to that, because naturally to buy the material, you need to know the exact dimensions. We know that he was painting 7 of these paintings, and we know their dimensions. That 2 were longer than the others, just over 10 feet long, while the others are a little more than 7 feet long. So that is one of the longer paintings. So St. Paul's statues, Hajar tanks, photographs, sorry, we also have the Saplina hypogeum, which is closer in dimensions, St. Paul's catacombs there. And note, they're not framed here. The paintings that we know of, which survive from this collection, so the ones that are Dalam, 2 at our Dalam, the 2 in the main staircase, the allegories in the main staircase of the Maritime Museum, which are now in storage at the moment, and another painting which I shall come to, all have a very similar black frame. But that could only have been done after they come back to Malta, because they are made to be mounted in a frame this way. And interpolating all this, we can reconstruct much of where the paintings were hanging. So St. Paul's statues and Hajar here, between the doorway to the main window and this exit. The Wil Dalam landscape, Ar Dalam watermelon landscape. And now that we know that there is the Saflina hypogeum, that very probably was one of the 2 corners, which looks like a longer bit of wall than that, marginally longer, but it's clearly shorter than these 2 walls here, where you have the 10-foot paintings. So it's all beginning to fit. So we're missing one painting. One very likely possibility, which I would stop short of saying it's definitely it, because it would be nice to have a clincher, and probably that clincher is sitting in an archival inventory somewhere, which I haven't stumbled on yet, but I'm sure somebody will very soon, is this painting, which some of you may remember hanging over the reception desk of the Maritime Museum before it closed down for refurbishment. And you see what the painting is doing. Robert Caruana-Dinkley's idea of a Phoenician vessel and a contemporary Maltese boat, and this makes sense in the context of the debates and the widely held belief that not only are the Maltese descended from Phoenicians, but also that that period it was widely held that the Maltese language was largely derived from the Phoenician inhabitants. And if you want to read more about the background to this, Nicholas Vell and Oliver Jacks have a seminal study about the background to this debate called The Lure of the Antique, published about 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, and extremely influential in our approaches to this. So what is going on here? I'd like to make a suggestion very quickly. One wonderful document which is sitting in the records of the Parliament of Malta, which are remarkably organized, mint condition, is this map of the Wembley exhibition. And the reason it's there is thanks to this gentleman who tells us that he walked down to Thomas Cook, the offices of Thomas Cook, to buy the map, and he came as a member of the Legislative Assembly, we now had a bicameral, for a short period, a bicameral government. He raises this complaint, which you know from the debates, and saying, how come you have put Malta next to other African countries? We belong to white countries. Nobody questions the overt racism of the statement, but the response from the government is, no, actually, you're wrong, because you see there, this is a document laid on the table of the House, and looking closer, it was told that actually there's Cyprus and Palestine there, so it's a Mediterranean section, so it's not a problem. The patterns we observed before about the way these different territories and dominions were represented would probably have given Carmelo Musulbonici more reason to worry if he had actually come to the exhibition itself. Now, the Knights of John had given a perfect visiting card for Malta. Yeah, there is just that one picture, which would be nice to show. Okay. And if you look at the pavilion of in the colonial and Indian exhibition back in the 1880s, the Knights of St. John are the main theme. And this is an observation which has been made by David Zamit, papers published in 2015 and 2020, respectively, that the rhetoric of Malta as a bulwark of Christendom is one which is adopted by the British, again, to legitimize their position in Malta and to legitimize the idea that Malta was destined to be an island fortress. And Sandra de Bono made this point about the exterior of the Wembley exhibition. Fantastic. In which he argued that this was part of this legitimization process, actually showing Malta as literally an island in the sense of an insula, a building block, which is also a face with 3 gates all around. It couldn't be more literal than that. And this is something which goes back to the 19th century. But with the emergence of self-government, with all this rethinking that is going on and the consultation that happens, and Themistocles Zamit, that we saw, progressively making inroads into the agenda, the new narrative of Maltese prehistory fits perfectly into the political need for a new discourse about a distinctive Maltese identity. And it's important that it is an identity which distinguishes us from Africa at that stage, because of the background of racism and racist policy which Malta has to endure in this period. Even so, even with all the European white credentials, this is the period when a Maltese dockyard worker is paid much less than a British dockyard worker on the same workbench doing the same work. And even people like Lord Strickland are writing to Leo Amery about this when he becomes first Sea Lord, even after the exhibition. It's only with after the Second World War that injustice is correct. So the credentials, the roots, and archaeology are an immensely important part of the political agenda. And not to overshoot, this is a glimpse of the Malta Pavilion, thanks to the National Museum of Archaeology, which has a whole set. But you see at a glance the Knights of St. John team, which is kept at Wembley. But in addition, at Wembley, we now have prehistory, which in the 19th century was much less politically charged. There is, of course, that famous quote by Zakaria from Roncalli, where he's the first to refer to these in a modern context as a political statement, but just to respect the time, what Zamit and his co-workers do, and we see this in the testimony that they give in the 1931 Royal Commission, which is sent to investigate the constitutional crisis which is unfolding in Malta. He has an idea which he's developing even as early as 1912, that all the different civilizations which passed through Malta had very little impact in terms of ethnicity and race. And he tries to argue, he builds a case in 1912 that the present day population is descended from the prehistoric population. With the excavations at Tarshin and the sterile layer, which he himself identifies, he needs to rethink this. But in his testimony to the Royal Commission, he still hangs on to the one thing which cannot be contested, which is language. And he says, I should use the exact words. So he's acknowledging that the Bronze Age civilization is probably not directly derived from the Neolithic one. But then he makes this statement. Everything tends to show that when the Maltese prehistoric monuments were erected, they must have been constructed by people who talked a Semitic language. And he's very emphatic when asked, is there any trace left of the Arab root? I should say no trace. And Robert Gallia, who becomes another rector of the university, is even more explicit about it, where he says that basically the temple builders spoke Maltese. And I know I've run out of time, but this is an idea that continues to reverberate in the popular imagination. When we speak about the temple builders, we often say our forefathers, political discourse, God's discourse. I just briefly show one last picture of this. You know the Maltese Grima, which is a familiar part of our landscape. Do you remember the Gateway to History book? Do you remember this image? What did the prehistoric inhabitants use as a dwelling? A Grima. And that's the 1960s, so they may not have yet heard about David Trump's excavation of the huts at Skorba, but this in Giant Malta, which is the book I was brought up on, is less forgivable. They still have a I'll stop there, not to test your patience. Thank you.